We've been having a very interesting discussion here in class about the concepts of eternity and infinity, which the Vikings did not have. And so a couple of people brought up the idea that Viking concepts are cyclical, that they think of the cosmos sort of reinventing itself, ending and starting over again, and then going through the same pattern in a cycle like the year does, and then ending and starting over again. What do you think about that?
They place limits on everything. There's a limit established for everything.
Oh, well I'm not following your logic. I'm sorry. Well,
Everything has a limit. Everything has a starting point and an ending point. And just like with nature, with seasons, with...
But it's not an end forever, though, because then it starts over again and repeats itself. What do you think?
Well, I mean, since we established that they're very pragmatic, and there's no such thing as eternity or infinity in a pragmatic world, I mean, it's impossible to witness something like that. And if you can't witness it, you can't conceive it. If you can't conceive it, you can't incorporate it into your ideology.
If you can't conceive it, but you can see the year and the seasons repeating itself over and over again, and so it mirrors the natural cycles of the seasons and the harvest and the planting and the cycles they go through, the natural cycles that the world goes through in spring and summer and fall and winter and so on, the same thing over and over again. This concept that they have of the universe mirrors that kind of a cyclical universe. And it's much harder to think of there being only one beginning and then going on forever to one end, as Christianity does, and as the Hebrew religion does. It's a much more difficult concept. As we pointed out, the Hindu religion has that same cyclical thing over and over again, and so does Zoroastrianism, that that the world comes to an end and then a new and better world is reborn in Zoroastrianism. The Hindus have the idea of reincarnation that sort of looks at the cycles that go on and on. You said you just took a class in Greek mythology. Do the Greeks say anything like that in Greek mythology? What kind of a concept do they have?
They really don't go on the cycles kind of thing. They tend to have sort of an eternity sort of thing. You never saw a downfall of any sort of god. You never saw anything like that. They never believed that Rome would end. They thought it would go on forever. Or the Greeks or whatever. It's just, they never really thought that it would get worse, I think. Makes me think that.
So Greece doesn't have seasons.
Greece doesn't have seasons? Well, that's kind of true.
It seriously doesn't. It's always, I mean, kind of hot and sunny.
Yeah, kind of hot and sunny in the Mediterranean. Yeah, true. Yeah, the Romans are different though. The Romans do have seasons, and they do go out and fight, and they assemble on the field of Mars in the spring, and then they go off to war. But neither the Greeks nor the Romans take religion very seriously though, and I don't think the Vikings did either. I mean, as you read the sagas, as you read Egil's saga, what did you think? What did you think was Egil's major concern? I mean, was he worried about the gods and religion? What was your impression from reading Egil's saga? What do you think? Yeah.
I can't really remember looking at, I mean, I didn't pay attention to that aspect.
Okay, when you were reading it, you weren't asking that question, what was his attitude toward the gods?
You know, it seemed to me that he was more worried about luck than he was about, the gods or anything else.
Yeah, he wasn't very worried about the gods. I mean, it didn't really come to his mind very often to think about the gods or to worry about them. But he was very concerned about his luck. Yeah. So that we have a very different kind of operation in the everyday world going on than they're not very religious. They're just not all that concerned with religion. I mean, they have these stories that explain how the universe goes on and how it operates, but they're not very worried about it. But you wouldn't really know that from the kinds of rituals they have. Because it sounds like they're really scared because they practice a lot of sacrifice, which it's kind of leads you to believe that they take it very seriously. So why don't I tell you about that, and then maybe we'll have time at the end to discuss, what's going on here and why are they, on the one hand, not paying much attention to religion, but on the other hand, getting involved in really serious sacrifices. I mean, on a huge level, the sacrifices. Well, they actually do have holy places, and they have holy places where that are usually natural sites, so that there'll be maybe a spectacular place in the landscape, a certain place in the landscape that is very outstanding. For example, Helgafell in Iceland, which is a small natural outcrop of rock resembling a long burial mound. So it's kind of a natural kind of a cliff that looks like a long burial mound. But from that cliff, if you stand on top of it, you get a superb view over the island, as if you were in the seat of Odin overlooking the whole world. And it's described in Bigja saga, the story of men on Snæfellsnes, a family saga, that Helgafell had to be free of pollution, and that there men and beasts were kept free from injury, and no injury could be committed. No man should look at it unwashed. And so there's kind of more of a ritual to it. And here is a map of Iceland actually this is to the northeast of Iceland, and here is Helgafell, this rather interesting outcropping here right beside the high mountains, and actually in a river valley, if you can see the river valley here. And here is a picture of it, and this is the outcropping of rock that seemed to them sort of supernatural, because it looked like maybe a tomb that they might have a mound that would have been a tomb. But you can see this massive valley that it overlooks, and what a majestic landscape this is anyway. But Iceland is just full of majestic landscapes. Helgafell became an intellectual center of West Iceland, and where they had a considerable library. Thorolf believed that he and his family would pass into this mound of Helgafell when they died, and so they might have seen it as kind of an entrance to the other world, or perhaps the other world itself, a dwelling for the dead. Because from one side the hill resembles a house with a door. So again, a lot of this is guesswork, and I'm following Ellis Davidson here in her speculation about what they thought about the dead, because they didn't really write a lot about it. The problem is they wrote poetry, and poetry is very difficult to interpret. It's poetic, and it's loaded with meanings and symbols. Well, another example is the meeting place of the Althing, and in Iceland this was Thingvellir. It was selected in the 10th century by Ulfjot's brother Grim, and Ulfjot had just returned from Norway with the law code, and he literally explored all Iceland to find it, the absolute ideal location for Thingvellir and the Thing stone that marked the place where Thingvellir, the meeting place of the Althing, would be held. It's the seat of the gods, and you remember that the gods meet under Yggdrasil at the seat of the gods where they took counsel. Well, this is the counterpart in the real world, in the human world, where they have a place where all the leaders can take counsel together. It's formed by a natural volcanic rift in a large sunken valley, and the swift river Oxara flows through it into a large lake. A line of twisted rocks provides an impressive background, And it forms a kind of natural amphitheater, a speaking place for the law speaker. And he would stand with the line of twisted rocks to his back and the open plain stretching out in front where everybody could gather for a meeting. It kind of reminds you of the Greeks finding a natural amphitheater, doesn't it, in order to carry on the plays, the theater, a natural formation. Well, this is what they found as a place for the thing. And booths would be set up for 2 weeks in midsummer by all the landowners around this natural meeting place, and the site would be accessible from all over Iceland. There would be woods for fires and pasturage for their animals, a good water supply, and the river may have been diverted there. But there's no reference to temples of any kind, so they don't seem to have had a temple. There's no archaeological evidence of buildings being built at Thingvellir. In addition to Thingvellir, which is the major place where the Althing, the National Assembly, met, each of the 4 quarters of Iceland had its own small thing place, and I'm going to show you the thing place in the west in a moment. Everything concerning the law was under the rule of the gods, and the place of assembly where they met to discuss the law was a hallowed one. The Althing always opened on Thursday, which was Thor's day, and of course it was held under the open sky, and Thor was a sky god. Okay, here is Thornest Thing. This is actually Thornest Thing where, let's see if I can find, I'm not sure if I can find the rock of Thornest Thing, but here are the buildings that were, let's see, in the center are the ruins of the booths, so this must be the ruins of the booths, and here is the natural amphitheater right here. Okay, that seems to be it. The Doom Ring and Thor's Stone. All right, here is the Thor Stone at Thor's Nest Thing, and this would have been the Western Thing, the Western Assembly. And here would be the natural amphitheater behind, and the stone that was the place of assembly. Sacrificial feasts were held there too, and there was a ban on carrying arms there, but it was not always enforced. And in fact, Thingvellir remains a place of pilgrimage for Icelanders to this day. It's kind of like the sacred groves mentioned by Tacitus. The images of the gods don't survive in very large numbers, and this is one reason why I had such a hard time getting some figures of gods to show you, because not very many remain. They had to be metal to survive, because the Vikings mostly made them of wood, and so they've disappeared. One survives from Brodenbjerg in North Jutland. It has a mask-like face and an enormous phallus, and it was mounted on a heap of stones. Which god do you think that might be? No, it wouldn't be Loki.
Frey or?
Frey. It would be Frey, because he's a fertility god. If it has an enormous phallus and a mask-like face, it's probably Frey. And was mounted on a heap of stones. There was another at Rude Eskilstrup in Sealand, a seated male figure with a bearded face, large eyes, and a cloak, and a threefold neck ring. And here she's guessing whether it's Celtic or Germanic, but without related finds, it's impossible to date. There's also a female figure from Raybelt, and actually that's the figure she has on the cover of her book, the figure I showed you before, which has the ring around its neck, and so she thinks it might be Celtic or Germanic. But I've seen one picture of Thor that's face is like that. There's also a female figure from Raybelt, and here are our female figures again. We don't know if these are women or goddesses or what they are. I mean, here are these little metal figures, and we don't know what they are, you know. Just like, remember our little are little amber figures where we were trying to figure out what they were, and we finally thought they might be game pieces. And you know, I found some more evidence for that today. I'll tell you when we come to it that they might be game pieces. Okay. Mounds and standing stones were very popular places. They were more abstract monuments to set up in sacred places. For example, the great mound burials of kings. These were favorite sacred places. Some Swedish mounds had flattened tops with a slight slope, suggesting a kind of stage where the king could get on top of the mound. And remember that there's no priesthood here, and that the priests who carry out the rituals are normal leaders of society. They're political leaders, and then they take on the role of priest when it's time to do a religious ritual, because their normal life is spent as a political, politico. What do you want to call him? Being very political. And so with these Swedish mounds with flattened tops, it suggests a sort of a stage. There's a Norse legend that the burial mound is a place where kings and seers obtained wisdom and inspiration. And people actually would go and sort of sleep on these mounds, hoping that the dead would speak to them and give them insight and wisdom. And so the mounds were sacred places. The kings would often go onto the mounds and make announcements and proclaim new laws, and a new ruler could be installed from the mound. And so these mounds would be favorite places, and they were man-made mounds. They were mounds under which they buried kings or noblemen. One example is Tunwald Hill on the Isle of Man, and the Manx Parliament still assembles there. It's an artificial hill on the site of an earlier burial mound, and it's kind of stepped, and there's a place on top for a monarch. Okay, I'm going to show you some of these mounds. Here is one. It's not a very high one. This is in an empty field in Denmark. It's not a very prominent mound. Here's another one, sort of seen from a distance. You can see what the mound is like that's out in the middle of nowhere, but obviously these are these graves that are outlined by these stones here. But here you recognize this mound. Where is this mound? Famous one I've shown you 3 times already. Anybody remember where this is?
Stockholm?
No.
Isn't that Harold Bluetooth's?
Yes.
No?
Yes, Harold Bluetooth's grave in Yelling. This is the Yelling Mound. Okay, remember I told you I got caught in the snowstorm that night? This is the next morning after the snowstorm. But can you see how you could, and there's actually steps that go up the side of it, and you go on top of it, and you can see all around the whole countryside. And here now they've improved the steps here, but you can go on top, and you can see how it would be a natural kind of stage for the king to carry out ceremonies and make announcements and proclaim the law and do all sorts of things. This was the day before the snowstorm hit, but we can see the mound and the size of it. And here is another mound so that you can see the natural level of the earth, and it's an artificial mound with the grave underneath. So this is how a mound would normally be made. And here is another one up on the side of a seashore. And often people would be buried on a cliff overlooking the sea in a ship-shaped burial. And so this is one of those graves that would be like that. And so it would be a sacred place. I mean, a king or a chieftain would be buried in a place like that, overlooking the whole sea. There often would be lower levels for bishops and deemsters, and I tried to find what a deemster was, and she didn't define it, and it wasn't in her index. And I think that they're officials that do something in the government. But there were also levels for members of the House of Keys. A stone figure of Gerslanden stood on a burial mound, and in Scandinavia carved stones sometimes were placed on top of them. In Sweden, rounded stones survive that are difficult to date, so you might have a mound with a stone right on top of it, marking it as a sacred place. Domed or pyramid-shaped stones were also found, and the Danish chronicle, and that would be, and now I can't remember his name, but the Danish chronicle refers to Danerig near Viborg in Jutland, which was used to proclaim a new king. Olaus Magnus mentions Morasten near Uppsala, the huge and rounded stone on which the Swedes raised their chosen ruler. So the mounds are not only religious places, but they're places where political rituals take place as well as religious rituals. So they have this sort of dual function. Prominent elements in the carrying out of the religion and the rituals is the pillar and the tree. In Celtic and Germanic cultures, pillars are common. For example, in Irminsul, as a Universalist columna, there is a large column, in other words, that is a sacred center. This is paralleled by the Scandinavian world tree Yggdrasil, which is the main symbol of the central pivot of the universe. The so-called high seat pillars of wood form the main support in the center of halls and sanctuaries. And have any of you read the Vinland sagas yet? Some people read them ahead of time because they're so interesting. Well, I guess they're not in the Vinland sagas, but they're more in the settlement of Iceland. When the settlers would come and they'd sail their ships around Iceland, what they would do is throw the high seat pillars that they had brought from their homes in Norway, they'd throw them over the side and they'd let the tide carry them in. And wherever they were brought to shore, that was the place where they would build their settlement. That's where they would live. And so they would kind of let the gods decide by letting the waves and the currents take it in. These were high seat pillars of wood that had formed the main support in the center of their halls at home, and they took them with them to be the centers of support in their new homes in Iceland. These might be viewed as the northern version of the Germanic pillars that would be in their houses and temples. And these were associated with Thor, and as I just mentioned, they were taken to Iceland by the early settlers from Norway. There were also legendary tales of royal halls with a living tree in the center. For example, the saga of Sigurd the Volsung told the story of a tree that supported the royal hall of his grandfather, King Volsung, so that a tree in the center of the hall would be a sacred object, and then that was later on replaced by a kind of pillar that would then symbolize a tree in the middle of the hall. Beneath Yggdrasil was the assembly place of the gods and the 9 worlds of the gods and men and the giants and all other beings. And I had a picture of this is actually a Norwegian church, but it seemed to me that the pillars that supported this church on the outside might be the kind of pillars we might be looking for in looking at pillars that. This is an example of what a wood pillar would look like. No temples survive, no pillars survive. They just are reported in the sagas, and so the churches survive. And so if we can look at elements and maybe get an idea of what the pillars look like. This is in the wrong place. I need to put that someplace else. Okay, there also were enclosed sanctuaries. And they weren't necessarily buildings that were enclosed to be a sanctuary or a place of rituals. They needed to provide an enclosed space from time to time, and when they did, they enclosed it with ropes. For example, a court of law. They might want to define what that space was, and so they would sort of string ropes around where they wanted to hold a court of law. Or they could mark it out carefully on the earth as an area for an official duel. But they didn't do it inside. They didn't build buildings for it. They marked it off on the ground outside, or they marked it with ropes. They made squares on the floor of a wizard to call up the dead. Or they would mark it outside with stones, setting them around the round graves. And I showed you a picture of that mound. It had those stones set around the round graves. Earthworks or ditches could mark off worship or special rites. There is a description of temples in Scandinavia, and there are several descriptions of them, but they're written relatively late, and none of these buildings survive at all. So there are no temples or buildings that we can look at. On the other hand, some mysterious little gold foil things survive called goldgubber in Denmark, and they're little gold foil plaques that have pictures on them that usually depict two figures, a man and a woman facing each other and embracing, that may perhaps be associated with fertility rites. Did they symbolize the marriage of the god and the goddess, or marriage of a family, or marriage in general? Again, we don't know. Here are these little pictures, and I don't have one for you, but what are they? I mean, you know, people just have to guess. Historians and archaeologists just have to guess. They might have been used to hallow a temple building. We know from Adam of Bremen that the temple at Mayer was of wood, and also the temple of Uppsala. And Adam of Bremen makes the comment that the temple of Uppsala was a splendid building with a roof of shining gold. And let me describe that for you. When he describes the temple of Uppsala, it has the roof of gold. He also says, let's see, in this temple, entirely decked out in gold, the people worship the statues of three gods in such wise that the mightiest of them, Thor, occupies a throne in the middle of the chamber. Wotan, which would be Odin, and Fricko, which would be Frey, have places on either sides. The significance of these gods is as follows. Thor, they say, presides over the air, which governs the thunder and lightning, the winds and rains, fair weather and crops. The others, Wotan, that is the furious, carry on war and imparts to man strength against his enemies. The third is Fricko, who bestows peace and pleasure on mortals. His likeness, too, they fashion with an immense phallus. But Wotan they chisel armed, as our people are wont to represent Mars. Okay, he already sees a likeness with the Greek god Mars. Thor, with his scepter, apparently resembles Jove. Okay, Jove is the Roman god that corresponds to Zeus in the Greek gods, and both of them are gods of thunder. So he sees that correspondence. The people also worship heroes, made gods whom they endow with immortality because of their remarkable exploits. Okay, and he mentions a King Eryx. Now, and here's a little addendum. Near the temple at Uppsala stands a very large tree with widespread branches, always green winter and summer. What kind it is, nobody knows. There is also a spring at which the pagans are accustomed to make their sacrifices, and into it to plunge a live man, and if he is not found, the people's wishes will be granted. A golden chain goes round the temple. It hangs over the gable of the building and sends its glitter far off to those who approach, because the shrine stands on level ground with mountains all about it, like a theater. Okay, that Adam of Bremen is sort of confirming what we've said so far. There's no clear plan of a pre-Christian shrine found under the church in Uppsala, so we don't really know what they look like. The modern model is reconstructed by details of Saxo Grammaticus of the Wendish temple, and Saxo Grammaticus is the Danish chronicler, by the way. Individuals in Scandinavia also set up small shrines for their own use, and for example, Thorolf of Helgafell built a temple for Thor near his house in Iceland. He made a sacred ring of the god, and a bowl was used for sacrifices, and the bowl was kept there. But maybe these were just farmhouses, and so some authors think that they just held the rituals in a farmhouse. Or they might have had a room within their house, but it wasn't necessarily sacred. I mean, they would just use it once in a while for the rituals. And so often they didn't even have a separate building for the rituals to take place. Farmhouses could have been used for communal religious feasts of the Godi of the district. And Godi is a singular word for a great man or a powerful man, the leading man of the district. This is a wooden, again, this is a wooden church that survives, and so some historians guess that maybe these really distinctive churches in Norway, these wooden churches, might be modeled on pagan temples. And here is the wood carving that might be on one of these churches. Here's the door, very beautiful decorated wood, and the wood carving all around it that you can see here. Yes, you can see very nicely in that close-up. Here is the kind of wood carving that survives on many of the other churches, and so the wood carving is one of the most common art forms of Scandinavia. And so if there were temples, historians think they might have looked like these churches in Norway, something like these churches in Norway, and I'm going to show you some of those churches in a minute. The wooden stave churches were built in Norway in the 11th to the 13th centuries, and these may provide a possible clue to pre-Christian sacred buildings. But only 31 of these stave churches survive, and they're strikingly different from the stone churches of England and Germany and all the rest of the Christian world. I mean, there's nothing like the stave churches in Norway. They are utterly distinct and original and different from anything you see anywhere else in Europe. In the 12th century, they built ground sills, 4 massive timbers in a square, and from these 4 massive timbers, a series of masts arise to support the walls and the roof, and the churches are rounded at the foot like the masts of a ship. In the center are central pillars rising at the crossing, and the earliest stave churches have the rich and fantastic wood carvings on the doors and the walls. And that was the one I had in the wrong place a moment ago, and perhaps we can turn back to it if I can find it real quick. Yes, and so this is a doorway of a church that would have this massive carving. This is 12 feet tall. It's 12 feet tall. The height of the door is 7 feet. So, I mean, it's a just massive and very ornate carving that would be the entrance to these churches. And so it's possible that the pagan temples looked like them. And here are some pictures of those churches. Here is the church, and notice that it comes up in sort of layers. It's very tall and narrow, so that you're focused toward rising up to God from the bottom, almost like a ship turned upside down, like we saw their houses were. And you have this same feeling with the churches, except that they're now very narrow and pointed up toward the top. And of course they're all wooden, and they're very beautifully woodworked. And here is a little close-up of these gables, and with crosses on each of the corners of the gables. And you know why that's important? Because sometimes they didn't put crosses there, but sometimes they put dragon heads like they would on a ship on these gables, and I'll show you one of those in just a minute. Okay, but this is what the wooden church would look like. They would put grim, sinister heads at points where the pillars touch the roof on the inside, and these were not Christian symbols. They were more like figureheads of a ship that were protruding, and they also were on the gables outside. So these sinister heads were on the inside and the outside, an obvious link with the construction of ships. Inside, the roof rises in the center with the impression of narrowness and height drawing the gaze upward. A building of this kind would emphasize the centrality of the sacred place, and the different levels accord with the picture of the world of the gods and men grouped vertically and horizontally around the world tree. So So Ellis Davidson sees these churches as a kind of mirror image of the pagan organization of how a temple would organize the men and the gods around Yggdrasil, or the world tree. And here is a picture of these dragons. Again, we have crosses down here, but at the top, where they're really overlooking all the land, are the dragon heads, overseeing all of the land, and they go up endlessly and repeating to the top. And here's a little chest. It seemed to me when I saw this chest that these dragon heads are exactly parallel to the dragon heads that you see on those gables. It reminded me very much of a kind of gabled temple on this reliquary, which is a chest, a Christian chest in which relics were kept. And so you see the blending together of these traditions that might have been from pagan traditions being blended into Christianity. And here again is our rune that could well be, again, or might be the picture of Yggdrasil and the gods, the world tree. It sure looks like the world tree to me, anyway. Okay, feasting and sacrifice. They had regular rituals to renew and strengthen the communications with the natural worlds. They had great communal feasts with the hallowing of ale or mead, and so drinking lots of ale and mead would hallow the feast and make it sacred, but they drank a lot anyway. They would also sacrifice a lot of living creatures. They gave offerings of booty taken in war, so that not only would they sacrifice animals and food that would later be feasted upon, and the ale, but also they would sacrifice some of the things they'd captured in war. And we'll see some pictures of some of these sacrifices they've made. Ibn Fadlan described the Viking merchants of the Volga who made offerings of food and cattle to wooden figures, and they hoped in return to receive luck in trading and war. Another 10th century Greek or Byzantine account says that the Vikings sacrificed cocks or roosters when they reached St. Gregory's Island in southern Russia in thanksgiving for their safe journey. And so we see this sacrifice as a regular part of their religion. Offerings in this Russian ritual on the island of St. Gregory, offerings were placed around an enormous oak tree, and the oak was associated with Thor, the sky god who assisted travelers. So in this case, the Greek description may have been a description of a sacrifice to Thor. In this case, a sacrifice of thanksgiving for leading them there safely. A 10th century Spanish Jew from Cordoba wrote an account of pre-Christian Hedeby. He says that they ate fish, they threw unwanted infants into the sea, and they sang like growling dogs. Okay, a music critic here comment on their music. They hold a feast where all meet to honor their god and to eat and drink. Each man who slaughters an animal for sacrifice, whether an ox, a ram, a goat, or a pig, fastens it to a pole outside the door of his house to show that he has made his sacrifice. We started talking about how they weren't concerned necessarily with living forever and eternity. All of this killing makes you think that, that death is such a part of their life that they're not really concerned about it, that death doesn't mean that much to them. They would have special occasions for sacrificing if they arrived at a holy place, or setting up a new house, or victory in battle, the opening of the thing or the assembly, the death of a king. So These would be sacrifices on special and unusual occasions, but they also had regular festivals where they had communal feasting at the points of the seasonal round important for farmers and herdsmen and hunters and fishers and warriors. So they would have a harvest festival and a spring planting festival and the midwinter and the midsummer festival, all of which they would carry out sacrifices. The 2 half years of the Icelanders made up a year of 364 days, and an extra week was added to the year every 7th summer. So about 11 to 18 October were the winter nights, the start of winter, and they would offer sacrifices for the plenty of the harvest and the beginning of winter and conserving for the winter. 9 to 15 April were the summer nights, the start of summer. And there they would offer sacrifices because they wanted good luck in raids and expeditions. They wanted more booty. Yule, of course, was the midwinter feast, the winter solstice on December 21st. And then they would sacrifice for the growth of crops. There might be other times when feasting took place depending on local conditions. But the holding of a feast was a matter of pride and reputation among the great men, and no matter what, they would have to have eating and drinking, feasting to all its excesses. Drinking hallowed the hall when the men met for the sacrifice. So the drinking was just as important as the eating. They drank from horns, which they carried around the hall from the high seat, and the horns were often given names, often linked with Odin. Grim equals Odin, for example. The brewing of ale, on the other hand, was associated with Thor. When the Aesir and Vanir declared a truce from their warring, they brewed ale together, each spitting into the bowl, and so this apparently brought peace, the mingled spit. Not very appetizing. It was customary in one of these feasts of sacrifice to drink 3 main toasts. For example, one to Odin for power and victory, one to Njord and Freyr for peace and good seasons, and one to the memory of their dead ancestors. The sacrificial meal might be meat boiled in a cauldron. It might be a whole pig, a whole bull or ox, and in that case they would probably roast it. I don't think they had a cauldron that big for a bull or an ox. And here are our men, here are our little warriors. They actually have boars' helmets, so you can see their boars. Here are their tusks that they might sacrifice these boars, and then the men would go into the hall and drink. And here is my favorite drinking horn. I really like this ivory drinking horn with a beautiful carving on it. It's very big. It's about 3 feet tall. It's a huge drinking horn. The whole company could drink out of it. Sometimes the meat was roasted, and there's stories about gods who cooked meat and roasted or boiled whole animals. They cooked them and then they resuscitated the animals, brought them back to life, and then cooked them again. It's good to be God. The supply never ends. There was a tradition that warriors plunged into the cauldron were likewise resuscitated, and I hope they didn't try it out, but there was that tradition. The chief cult animals were the boar, the bull, and the horse. The bull was associated with Thor and also the Vanir deities of fertility. The horse was associated with the journeying sun racing across the sky. The rams, goats, and stags could also be sacrificed, and so could dogs and birds. And sometimes, and the ritual at Uppsala is described as sacrificing all of these animals, one of each kind, for 9 days in a row. So that would be 9 of each kind. And so, I mean, that is a massive sacrifice. There were also human sacrifices that were very common. Here is Adam of Bremen again. This time I wrote it out for you. It is the custom every 9 years for a common festival of all the provinces of Sweden to be held at Uppsala. Kings and commoners, one and all, send their gifts to Uppsala, and what is more cruel than any punishment Even those who have accepted Christianity have to buy immunity from these ceremonies. The sacrifice is as follows. Of every living creature, they offer 9 each, 9 heads, 9 each. And with the blood of those, it is the custom to placate the gods. But the bodies are hanged in a grove of trees which is near the temple. So holy is that grove to the heathens that each tree in it is presumed to be divine by reason of the victim's death and putrefaction. There also dogs and horses hang along with men. One of the Christians told me that he had seen 72 bodies of various kinds hanging there, but the incantations which are usually sung at this kind of sacrifice are various and disgraceful, and so we had better say nothing of them. It just occurred to me that Zoroastrians actually bury their dead in trees. They make platforms up in the tree, and they put the dead bodies up there either to putrefy or for the vultures to eat, for the birds to eat them. And so I just made that connection that putting bodies in trees, has that connection with the Persian religion. This festival may have lasted 9 days with 1 human victim and 1 of every species of animal or bird offered daily. So this is a really massive sacrifice. But remember, it only happens every 9 years. For some reason, they're really in love with the number 9 here. I'm not sure what it symbolizes. Usually, this great festival was done at the beginning of summer to Odin in return for victory. Fetmar of Mersburg tells of a similar festival held in Denmark, but he may be echoing Adam of Bremen, or he may be describing a similar festival. Germans and Celts also performed massive sacrifices of this kind. Weapons and other objects were deliberately damaged as grave offerings, and what they would do is bend the swords and chop up the blades of axes and other weapons. At Nydam and Skidamos on Åland, there were repeated offerings made representing the spoils of several battles. Sometimes the spoils of battles would be mixed with food offerings so that the gods were given a share of the communal feast. And some of the offerings of this of weapons and the booty and loot were so large that they must have been for an entire army or made by an entire army. Hanging was the common means of sacrifice, and criminals or prisoners or slaves were usually the common victims, and the choices were in that order. First they tried to find criminals. If they didn't have enough criminals, they would hang prisoners, and finally they would hang slaves. But slaves have economic value, so you don't want to hang your slaves except as a last resort. So criminals are first, and then prisoners. Ibn Fadlan's account of a funeral tells this whole story. Let me see if I can find that real quick. I don't know if I want to read you the whole thing, but I might read part of it to you. This is a Rus ship burial. I had heard that at the deaths of their chief personages, they did many interesting things, of which the least was cremation, and I was interested to learn more. At last I was told the death of one of their outstanding men. They placed him in a grave and put a roof over it for 10 days while they cut and sewed garments for him. If the deceased is a poor man, they make a little boat, which they lay him in and burn. If he is rich, they collect his goods and divide them into 3 parts, one for his family, another to pay for his clothing, and a third for making an intoxicating drink of beer, which they drink until the day when his female slave will kill herself and be burned with her master. They stupefy themselves by drinking this beer night and day. Sometimes one of them dies cup in hand. Okay. Okay. When a great personage dies, the people of his family ask his young women and men slaves, "Who among you will die with him?" One answers, I. Once he or she has said that, the thing is obligatory. There is no backing out of it. Usually it is the girl slaves who volunteer. When the man of whom I have spoken died, his girl slaves were asked, who will die? Oh, this is another version of that. Okay. When the day arrived on which the man was to be cremated and the girl with him, I went to the river on which was his ship. I saw that they had drawn the ship onto the shore, that they had erected 4 posts of birch wood and other wood, the pillars, and that around it, the ship, they made a structure like a great ship's tent out of wood. Then they pulled the ship up until it was on this wooden construction. Then they began to come and go and to speak words which I did not understand, while the man was still in the grave and had not yet been brought out. Then they brought a couch and put it on the ship and covered it with a mattress of Greek brocade. Then came an old woman whom they called the Angel of Death, and she spread upon the couch the furnishing mentioned. It is she who has charge of the clothes making and arranging all things, and it is she who kills the slave girl. I saw that she was a strapping old woman, fat and lowering. When they came to the grave, they removed the earth from above the wood, then the wood, and took out the dead man clad in the garments in which he had died. I saw that he had grown black from the cold of the country. They had put beer, fruit, and a Pandora in the grave with him. They removed all that. The dead man did not smell bad, and only his color had changed. They dressed him in trousers, stockings, boots, a tunic, and caftan of brocade with gold buttons. They put a hat of brocade and fur on him. Then they carried him into the pavilion on the ship. They seated him on the mattress and propped him up with cushions. They brought beer, fruits, and fragrant plants, which they put with him, then bread, meat, and onions, which they placed before him. Then they brought a dog, which they cut in two and put in the ship. Then they brought his weapons and placed them by his side. Then they took 2 horses, ran them until they sweated, then cut them to pieces with a sword, and put them into the ship. They took 2 cows, which they likewise cut to pieces, and put in the ship. Next they killed a rooster and a hen, and threw them in. The girl slave who wished to be killed went here and there and into each of their tents, and the master of each tent had sexual intercourse with her and said, "Tell your lord I have done this out of love for him." Then they led the slave girl to a thing that they had made which resembled a door frame. She placed her feet on the palms of the man, and they raised her up to overlook this frame. She spoke some words, and they lowered her again. They did this a second time. Then they did this a third time. Then they brought her a hen. She cut off the head, which she threw away. Then they took the hen and put it in the ship. I asked the interpreter what she had done. He answered, "The first time they raised her, she said, 'Behold, I see my father and mother.' The second time she said, 'I see all my dead relatives seated.' The third time she said, 'I see my master seated in paradise, and paradise is beautiful and green. With him are men and boy servants. He calls me, take me to him.'" Okay, then they take her to the ship, and the angel of death, the old woman, strangles her and puts her in with the master. Okay, she got to drink beer before they strangled her. Okay, and she said farewell to her girl companions. But here is a relatively unbiased eyewitness account of a funeral, of a Viking funeral, and the sacrifice. So that's Ibn Fadlan's account of a funeral. Here are the weapons that are put into a grave like that, and here they are bent so that nobody can ever use those weapons again when they're put in the grave with the dead. Here one is seriously bent. This is a sword that's been bent way up. Here are some different weapons and tools that have been bent. Here the edges of this axe have been ruined. Here's a shield boss, but that's been kind of chopped up, and bent swords here and here and here. You see how they've ruined the edge of this sword so that it can't ever be used. A needle for a woman that has been bent and can't be used, and a bent sword. Here a sword is bent in a circle. And I also had a few other things I had in the wrong place here. Let me see if I can find them real quick. here are some other things that might be put into the grave. Here is a hoard of coins. And here is some really beautiful jewelry. I love this collection of rings. Any modern woman would adore to have those rings. That might be, these are all grave goods that have been found. And so a hoard of coins and the beautiful rings would be put into the grave as well. According to legends, kings were sacrificed for good harvest, but this was exceptional. Only seems to have been done in dire circumstances. If there was a terrible drought or there was a famine, then the legends say they would actually sacrifice a king. And there is this really really horrifying story in which one of the kings decided that he would agree to be sacrificed, and he had it all set up where he would do this sort of mock sacrifice, and he would pretend to hang on a tree like Odin and pretend to have someone stab him in the side, but he reckoned without a very devout follower of Odin who wouldn't do the mock ceremony. He really hanged him and really stuck the sword into him, so the king was really sacrificed. So at least that's what the story says. The sacrifices were made to the gods to fulfill two needs. First, they wanted success in battle, and second, they wanted sufficient food to support the community. The rites for luck in battle included, as we said, the sacrifice of booty or loot. And sometimes they would set up severed heads as trophies, and sometimes the heads were reputed to speak after severing. There are all these stories about heads that have been chopped off, like one man was counting his money at the moment when his head was cut off, and he continued counting after the head was cut off, and he is regarded as a kind of sacred man or lucky or propitious when somebody does that. And that's really interesting because it reminded me of this story that is in Orderic Vitalis about post-conquest Normandy, when William the Conqueror, who I think was very Viking, but William the Conqueror from Normandy conquered England. And there is a story about one of the Anglo-Saxon earls, Earl Waltheof, in the north of England, who is reported to have joined in a conspiracy against William in one of the rebellions. Waltheof denied it and said he was innocent, but William found him guilty and at his court, and some Normans had joined with Earl Waltheof in the rebellion, and each of the national people had to be tried according to the law of their country. And so what happened to the Normans was they were sent into exile because that was the punishment for rebellion. But according to Anglo-Saxon law, rebellion or treason was punishable by death. So Earl Waltheof had to be executed. And so as he came up to his execution, he began to recite the Lord's Prayer. And when his head was struck off, the head continued until the very end of the Lord's Prayer. And the reason this was recorded, I think it's in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, it's certainly in Orderic Vitalis, but one of the local nunneries there wanted to make him a saint and tried to sanctify him and use his relics as a saint for the local people because his head had continued to say the Lord's Prayer. But this is very Viking. I mean, Vikings did this as well, so that's kind of interesting. It also made me think of the legend of the Headless Horseman, who is the great storyteller of the Americas, in the American colonies. Washington Irving, who tells the story of the Headless Horseman, which sounds very much like these executed people who tuck their heads under their arms and go around and scare people. I mean, there are lots of Viking stories about that, so it may be the origin of the Headless Horseman. But when it came to the needs of the practical, everyday, people didn't necessarily sacrifice to the gods, but rather they turned to the land spirit, the Lanvatir. The favor of the land spirits brought good fortune in farming, hunting, fishing, protection for children and animals. There's a story of brothers who lost their animals and were forced from their land by a lava flow, and this is the story that suggests these land spirits. One night Bjorn dreamed that a rock dweller came to him and offered to enter into partnership with him, and it seemed to him that he agreed. Then a he-goat joined his goats, and his livestock increased so rapidly that he was soon prosperous. After that he was called Goat Bjorn, and this was a name of honor. People with second sight saw how all the land spirits followed Goat Bjorn to the Thing, and followed his brothers Thorstein and Thord when they went hunting and fishing. Okay, so the land spirits were little people who followed these people around and brought them good luck. Trolls were said to defend people against evil or hostile beings, and even to foster and teach promising young men. They could be mountain dwellers, cave dwellers, rock dwellers, or they could live in springs or waterfalls, and these could be trolls or dwarfs or elves or fairies. All of these are land spirits that dwell in particular places throughout the landscape. They could be woods dwellers, and especially in Iceland, which had been deforested very quickly, the remaining groves were really considered sacred, and that's where the elves and the dwarves and the gnomes lived. Land spirits brought good luck, prosperity, and knowledge of the future, and it was risky to alarm or anger these powers, and that's why the dragon heads were removed from the prows of ships as they approached the land. And this is very interesting. Here is a sacred spring, and guess who it's dedicated to? Can you read this? Anybody know Old Norse or New Norse? This is St. John, okay? This was originally a sacred spring that was sacred to the Vikings, the elves, or the dwarves, and with Christianity, they made it sacred to St. John. They adapted it to Christianity, but this, I saw sacred springs like this all over Denmark. I just thought this one was pretty, very nice. Okay, let's see. The Vanir were linked with the land spirits, and especially elves. In Egil's saga, Egil appears to Freyr and Njord, and the land appeals to Freyr and Njord and the land spirits for justice against King Eric Bloodaxe, who had cut the ropes of the law court before judgment could be given. And so he appeals to Freyr and Njord, who are the Vanir, and the Vanir are connected to the land, and therefore the land spirits, like the elves. There are sacrifices to the elves in autumn in Sweden, and also sacrifices to the Disir, or female guardian spirits, on winter nights. These Disir, or female guardians, are pictured to be like the Valkyries, armed women in their armor, and such a female guardian spirit might follow a warrior overseas and protect him. And the female guardian spirit might also have links with a particular family. So luck was passed on from one generation to another. And here are some more female figures, and again, we don't know what they are, they're just female figures. Under Christian influence, these guardian angels came to be seen, or these guardian spirits came to be seen as guardian angels. And since the feast of St. Michael, or Michaelmas, is at the time of the Viking winter nights, St. Michael became a popular guardian angel in Normandy and England. And here is a Greek picture of St. Michael. This is the Greek image of St. Michael, who was very popular in Normandy and England, one of the most popular saints there. The land spirits could take on bird or animal shapes as well. They could take on the shapes of dragons, snakes, toads, birds, or bulls. And sometimes they were called the underground people and described as little red-capped men. And this immediately made me think of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, who were magic people who sort of worked in the mine all day. The Vanir and female mother goddesses were associated with trees and rocks and lakes, and in England they were these gardens and trees and rocks and lakes were associated with fairies, and the English still talk about fairies in their gardens. They brought fertility to the fields and the poultry and the cattle. Women who wanted children appealed to them, and they were also associated with spinning. These Disir, or female spirits, fostered and trained children, especially girls, to spin and to be good housewives. And there's also signs that the Vikings sometimes were dependent on their dead ancestors. They didn't really do ancestor worship, but they thought their ancestors could help them. If they might name a child after a grandparent, a famous grandparent, maybe name it for luck, or they might feel like the grandparent might sort of come to life again in this grandchild. Often they would sit or sleep on a burial mound to gain help or inspiration, and kings and fortune tellers and future poets tended to do this, to try to get inspiration from the dead person inside the mounds. Sacrifice was also a means of divination, foretelling the future or destiny, and the seeking of luck was closely associated with the rites marking the revolution of the seasons, as we've seen, the summer days and winter days and midwinter and midsummer, harvesting in autumn, the spring battle season. Foreknowledge or warnings of the future would bring good luck. On questions of fate and destiny, there were no formal rites for foretelling the future. All of this was done through individual efforts. Each individual would do it. And this would take the form of, sometimes they'd analyze dreams, or they would have dreams that would foretell the future, or they would have symbolic dreams which they would then have to interpret. They would observe plants and animals, and if a plant or an animal did something strange, they might read that as a portent of the future. They observed nature, like the waves, or sometimes there might be a rain of blood or some kind of natural event like a cow's milk being blood or full of blood. And in fact, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is one of your optional books, is full of stories like that, of natural events, which then foretell the future. I mean, it's everywhere. They might also cast lots, or they might cast dice or runes. And seeresses, or women with second sight, carried on a rite called seether, and this would be like foretelling the future. These priestesses were associated with Odin. The Norns cut a record on wood of the fate of every individual. This would mean writing runes on wood, which would sort of tell the fate of every individual. And something called the board game of the gods is described, which the gods played with golden playing pieces, and that made me think immediately of our little amber animals we had last time, and we were guessing that they might have been game pieces. If they were amber, they of course would be golden in color, so that suggests the game pieces of the gods. Well, how far does the future foretelling, how far does the figure foretelling the future have control of it? The power of destiny over the gods and men is seen in Ragnarok. The gods, in fact, have no power over their destiny. They are foreordained to be destroyed in Ragnarok. According to the stories, fate rules the world from the very beginning and unseats the very gods themselves. So this sort of speaks to predestination. But Yggdrasil survives all. He precedes the gods and outlasts their rule. The Aesir are the forces that bind and restrain, but the Vanir are the creative forces of life and growth. Fate and destiny are the outcome of the gods. They are foreordained, but human beings have luck. And so it looks like human beings are not necessarily foreordained, except insofar as whether they're born lucky or not. Luck means being in tune with the supernatural world and receiving help from it. It's a kind of rhythm with the world, knowing how the world works and being able to work with it. The world works with you. You're lucky. Thus, Ragnarok is the destiny of the universe, but luck can aid individuals within their lifetime. And so this is one reason the Vikings are so focused on luck, and we see that luck over and over again, their appeal to luck in the sagas. So, now we've gone through both the stories, the formal stories in all of the literature of the Viking religion, all the mythology that goes along with it, and we've done an overview of the ritual and rites that are concerned with it. Any questions or comments that come up for you? No, I've told you everything you ever want to know about Viking religion, right? Well, maybe here is our wonderful little diagram of the Viking world, and maybe we can return to this one again and see if we can still see the story of well, this caption actually says they illustrate the Eddaic songs and the Volsunga saga. The Eddaic songs are the Eddas, which tell the story, like the Valusta, which tells this story. So this caption thinks that it also has to do with the Eddaic songs. I still am convinced that that it has elements of it. Any questions or comments?
You know, I'll say it seems to me that there are some elements that are kind of have relationship to the Christian and Jewish creation, the tree, and then I think you said Odin got knowledge from the tree, and then also the snake as well. Seems to be kind of a common theme there.
Yes, and there's some question about, since everything was written down much later, it started out as oral poetry, there's some question about whether it was, whether Christianity influenced the legends as we have received them. But I think what you're seeing is a kind of correspondence between these legends and Christianity, enough that would make the conversion a little bit easier, don't you think? The Christian conversion. Do you see any... What elements of this Viking religion might make the conversion to Christianity a little easier, a little more logical to them? What you saw, you mentioned the tree and getting knowledge from the tree. It's not the knowledge of good and evil that Odin gets, though, like Adam. I mean, it's the knowledge of magic, which is something else. Yeah.
One thing I noticed was the number 3. And
number 3.
But then you have 3 in the Christian church also.
Yeah, they would be attracted to the Trinity because the number 3 is so common here. The 3 Norns. What other 3s do we have? The 3 Norns, the 3 gods, the 3 main gods. Yeah.
And 9. 3 3s make 9.
And 3 3s make 9. Yeah, yeah. Anything else that might make Christianity more logical to the Vikings that would come out of this religion? Any other elements that you see? Yeah.
What was the one god that was going to be resurrected? Can't remember his name.
The one god who was resurrected.
Yeah.
Okay. And yeah, Balder the Good was shot with mistletoe, which is a kind of woody thing. He's shot with mistletoe. He dies and he goes to hell, and he doesn't come back because remember that Loki didn't cry. Every living thing cried, but Loki didn't. So he had to remain in hell. But then after the end of Ragnarok, when the new world came into being, he was resurrected. And Balder the Good was also supposed to be a sinless person, or a really good person. Yeah, did you have a thought about that?
I was thinking that they probably would have liked the story of Job.
Oh, they might have liked the story of Job, yeah.
Related to it better than a lot of Christians might have.
Yeah, they might have. Well, I don't know. Job was pretty faithful to God, though, although they would remain.
But on the other end, on how the God was not fair.
No, the God was not fair, and that, yeah, God was not fair. They would relate to that. Anything else? Yeah.
What's also kind of interesting about the Ragnarok and the world starting over again, but also in the Bible, in Christianity, we have about the world being flooded, and it starts all over again with a new set.
Yeah, so we can see a correspondence with Noah, and you can bet your boots that those missionaries immediately latched on those correspondence and said to the Vikings, well, look how similar our religion is to yours. I mean, and can't you just add this one God to your pantheon and then drop all the other gods? And they could see, I mean, you can see how Balder the Good would relate to Jesus easily, or Christ. Any other correspondences you might think? We have 1 minute left to think of another correspondence.
It was funny in this book that we're reading where it said how the missionaries were talking about, how a good way to help them convert was to tell them, look at all these Christian nations, it's not cold there, and so that must be a powerful God.
Yeah, the missionaries pulled in everything they could think of. Right. Be Christian and get warm. Yeah, that was wonderful. Well, and surely the missionaries would use everything they could possibly think of. Okay, well, let me show you one last picture of a Viking grave, and here are those stones that they would set up. This is outlining of graves or stones outlining a particular place. And let's see if I have any other pictures. I have, we can end with our little Viking guys. Okay. Next time, we're going to look at the sagas in great detail, and I'll tell you lots of stories about the sagas, and by then, that will complete our overview of all of their culture, and then we'll be ready to launch out in the world and go a Viking with all of these guys. So we'll see you next week.